Well, good evening and welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. On the programme tonight, and it is something we really need to be concerned about, a startling indicator of how close we may be getting to irreversible global climate change. The World Meteorological Organization, which is the United Nations' systems authoritative voice on weather, climate and water, has come out with their latest findings, which indicate that global temperatures will surge to record levels in the next 5 years. In fact, the next 5-year period as a whole will be the warmest possibly on record. Now, we'll get to the main findings and we'll be joined by some of the finest climate change experts on this program. But just a programming note, at 9:30 p.m. this evening, it's been 9 years of the Modi government. We bring you a special documentary on foreign policy, The Modi Way. But first, what exactly is the huge concern with the potential 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures? What does it mean for us? We have this report. In a startling indicator of how close we may be to irreversible global climate change, the World Meteorological Organization has come out with its latest findings, which indicate that global temperatures will surge to record levels in the next 5 years. In fact, in the next 5-year period as a whole, there could be the warmest that we've had on record. Well, here are the main findings. Between 2023 and 2027, the temperatures near the Earth's surface could be up to 1.8 degrees centigrade higher than the 1850 to 1900 average, which has been used as a baseline since there were no emissions of greenhouse gases then. With an El Nino phenomena forming in the next few months, there'll be a significant warming trend globally starting perhaps next year. There's a 98% chance of at least one in the next 5 years beating the temperature record which was set previously in 2016. That's a cause of huge concern. There's also a 98% chance of the 5-year mean for 2023 to 2027 being higher than the last 5 years. Arctic warning is disproportionately high. That's been a constant concern now for several years. And precipitation patterns in this 5-year period indicate deeply inconsistency, with some regions receiving increased rainfall while other areas receive far less. So why is this important? Because an increase in global temperatures above 1.5 degrees will have an adverse impact with related losses and damages. Well, joining us now, Wilfran Mafuma Okia is the head of regional climate prediction at WMO, which has come out with this report. Thanks, Mr. Okia, very much for being with us. I think the first question is a basic one. What is the likely impact or the potential impact of a rise up to 1.5 degrees or more for billions across the world?
Thank you very much for having me. So first of all, we need to go back to 2018, where a UN body called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, produced a report on the impact of a warming of 1.5 and what it means for region. So to be short, what is happening, if we were to reach 1.5, it would be worse than today in terms of extreme, in terms of consequences. So reaching 1.5 is not a good news for the whole planet. And of course, 1.5 is the average for the whole planet, meaning there will be regions where the temperature will be very high than that number. Arctic is one, and there are other regions in the world.
Mr. Okia, specifically, what can this rise in temperatures mean, for example, for people over here in India? Would it be economic losses, a potential health crisis? What could it actually be?
The impact will be diverse. Perhaps a best analogy is to remind you of last year. Last year, we were supposed to be in a La Nina regime, let's say in a regime where the rise of temperature is kind of slowed down. And you can remember the extreme heat, some flooded in many regions of the world, including India. So that was in the case of a low temperature. Now, let's imagine what the report is saying is that the global warming, so the anthropogenic impact of human activity, combined with El Nino, will make the next 5 years being extremely hot. So it will be more worse than today. So essentially, we need to be prepared in different levels. But I think essentially for us is to make sure that our national Met services are able to provide us with the best alert system. So they need to have observation, they need to have capacity, so at least we can indicate to our government what is coming.
And Mr. Okia, I mean, I'm going through the report. There is an El Nino phenomena which is expected this year, the impact of which will be felt next year. So how is that combination of that El Nino effect and human factors together what the real concern is? I think that's the key point, because it's not just the El Nino, which is a phenomena which has always been there on our planet. It's when you combine a heating event caused by the El Nino with human factors that result in this crisis, right?
Yes. So first of all, maybe one thing to remember is that every decade are becoming warmer and warmer because of the climate change, right? So that's the trend. We are increasing the temperature. Now, El Nino will surge the temperature because when we have El Nino, the ocean release some temperature in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. That will add up to the trend in the background. So basically, the temperatures globally will be warmer, and that's very damaging for the society.
And what are the other key point I noticed is precipitation patterns around the world will be quite erratic. So some areas will have a great deal of rainfall, other areas will not. Firstly, where are the areas that you are likely to see a greatest variation from what the normal should be? And secondly, would you be able to tell us over here in India and in the Indian subcontinent what we may face?
Okay, thank you again. So basically, we need to be a bit cautious when it comes to the geographical impact of those forecasts, because first, those forecasts are meant to provide us with a global picture, because the weather is global. Now, also, in many regions of the world, what matters is the start of the rainy season, the end of the rainy season. So sometimes a global average doesn't mean anything, right? So basically, essentially, what the report is showing is that there are regions, if we pick North America, for instance, North Eurasia, there'll be an increase of precipitation over yearly. In some other region, let's say Australia, there'll be some deficit, and the same for the Amazonia. Now, to have a detailed picture of what is coming over India, we need the Indian National Met Services to refine that information, which is global, so at least they can pinpoint to the regional detail.
And sir, the other concern which you've raised is the extraordinary pace of Antarctic ice melting. How does that represent a huge problem for us? Because a rise in the level of sea waters will result in coastal flooding. It's bound to take place. And then add to that the dangers of warmer oceans on island territories, on coral formations, on the livelihood of millions, and on biodiversity in coastal regions. It's all interconnected, and we don't perhaps talk about this enough.
Yes, thank you. That's an interesting point to raise, and I think we should be talking much about this. Just one thing to reiterate here. With the global warming, we have an increase of the acidification. So the ocean become more acid, so which is killing coral. That's one. Now, interestingly, Arctic is one of the regions where the warming is much more important than anywhere. So this will cause to some flooding in some coastal area. So this is very important to think about it and to factor it.
And Mr. Okia, one of the concerns which we face in the Indian subcontinent is the phenomenal pace of glacial melt. We are dependent, billions are dependent in this region on water or rivers which come from fresh water sources from the Himalayas. But the speed of glacial melt means that there are other problems. For example, flooding takes place, and the sources of fresh water could ultimately disappear much faster than we want it to. So is this also a key concern which people in our region, in my region, could potentially face in the future?
I think this is a concern for the whole world. We need to be all paying attention to this. Everyone needs to act at this level. So we at the World Meteorological Organization, our role is to make sure we can collaborate with all the countries to provide the government with the best available climate information, right? Now, that happens at the planetary scale. At regional level, there need to be some collaboration. But more importantly, we need to have institutions, experts at national level capable of designing some strategies. That's where we need to have everyone working together.
Mr. Okia, a lot of people will say on the basis of reading your report that, look, we might rise to 1.5 degrees or a little bit more, but then, chances are it might come down as well. It's not as if it's going to remain stuck at 1.5. But there's a problem in actually saying that, because the point is we need a long-term solution. So it's not enough to say that, oh no, we'll touch 1.5, it's not going to be a big deal, it's going to come down. It has to be sustained at a much lower level.
Yes. So actually, again, you nailed it. So just to give you an example, the past 3 years we were in a La Nina regime, as I indicated. It's supposed to be a cooling, right? What we notice every 5 years or every 10 years, all La Nina are getting warmer. So essentially, even if we have a phenomenon like La Nina, which is kind of slowing down, but the overall temperature is going up, right? So again, we need to do something to cut down the emission at some point.
Right. Well, Mr. Okia, these are matters of huge concern. And a final question to you. At 2 degrees, right, beyond the temperatures now, it begins to get irreversible, right? That there will be irreversible damage. And that is what we don't want to get to at all.
Yes, so let's not speak about irreversibility, because that's maybe something we can argue. But one simple fact is that the report produced by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, they compare a world of 2 degrees versus a world of 1.5, or to be short, a world of 1.5 is worse than today. A world of 2 degrees is worse than the 1.5. So every half degree of warming is causing more damaging. So we don't need to get there, if we can.
Right. Well, Mr. Okia, these are all worrying signs, and I think it's important that we address the climate issues that you talk about and global warming in the manner that it deserves. Thank you very much, sir, for sharing that report and the details with us.
Bye.
To try and help us understand what the implications of this are, we're joined by Professor Navroz Dubash, who is with the Center for Policy and Research and the lead author of IPCC AR6. We're also joined by Aditya Valiathan Pillai, who's also with the Center for Policy Research, where he's a fellow. Navroz, let me come to you first in simple terms. If the temperature remains at 1.5 degrees above what it should be, what are the implications for us?
Well, thank you, first of all, for hosting this show and drawing attention to this issue, Vishnu. I think the first thing to really note is that global warming is really here with us. The only question is how fast will we see the impacts and how bad will they be and how fast can we react. So I think one of the things this report shows is the pace at which the certainty is growing. So in 2015, the science said it was close to zero that we would have a year with 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. By around 2017, 2021, they said it was a 10% chance. Now there's a 66% chance that we will break through 1.5 degrees, which has been kind of benchmarked as kind of a warning zone, right? And we shouldn't think of 1.5 as some kind of cliff face, because it's not that suddenly things happen at 1.5, but it's a marker of really serious impact, to the point where the Paris Agreement says that we should be trying to limit warming to 2 degrees and make every effort to limit it to 1.5. Now we might go ahead of 1.5, but the more we can reduce our emissions, we will actually come down to about 1.5.
Aditya, once we do touch 2 degrees, and that's perhaps still quite a few years, if not decades away, that would be irreversible, right? That's what we're trying to ultimately prevent.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Vishnu. That's right. I mean, 2 degrees would be an extremely, extremely bad piece of news for South Asia. The fact is, this piece of news that we have now from the WMO suggests we're breaching temperatures that previously have not been seen by modern human society. 2 degrees would put us in a situation where all the litany of potential damages on South Asia would all come to bear on us quite fast, right? So we have an extremely long coastline, which would be repeatedly battered. We'd have glaciers that were melting and so on. But thankfully, that is some distance away, and there's a fair bit one can do between now and then to prepare for it and to prevent the worst effects. There's a long process of change and adaptation. So it's not just about the impacts, it's also about other stuff.
Navroz, what about India? Where do we stand in terms of our efforts to ensure that we stay beneath 1.5 degrees or participate in a process where the globe stays under 1.5 degrees? There have been a lot of announcements which have been made, but realistically, where exactly are we faring?
Yeah, I think that's the central question. Can we actually take serious measures to slow down this train that is essentially, seems to be thundering down the tracks more or less without pause? And I think what we see is that the global community is now, there are some positive signs, but we are not moving as fast as we need to. So let's just take for a minute some of the positive signs. I'll come to India in a second. So technology costs have come down in renewable energy. That's the biggest big news. 85% reductions in technology costs for solar, battery storage, 50% odd for wind. And so now the question is, can countries pivot very, very fast to renewable energy? And that's not the only thing we have to do, but it's probably one of the perhaps single biggest thing we all have to do. And what we see is that the global situation has got much more complicated. In the post-Ukraine environment, countries are increasingly concerned about energy security. Some countries in Europe are reopening coal-fired power plants. They say it's temporary, which it probably is, but nonetheless, it's a step backward. India and many other countries are trying to accelerate renewable energy adoption, and we have some very ambitious targets. So at the moment, about a quarter of our energy comes from of our electricity comes from non-fossil fuel sources. That includes hydropower, and about just under half of our capacity is non-fossil fuel, and we're making quite a lot of strides. But the question is, can we collectively do this as fast as we need to? And invariably what happens is some finger pointing as to who needs to do it faster. And I think in this case, there's a case to be made that the West has to, in a sense, accelerate their transition in order to allow poorer countries more use of fossil fuels to the extent we need it for development. But at the same time, I think even we in India have to acknowledge that there is no high carbon path to development left for anybody anymore, right? So it's a balancing act. We need to squeeze as much we need to squeeze as much development out of every unit of carbon as we possibly can, and we need support in doing that, while the West also creates a little bit of space for us to both decarbonize and develop.
Aditya, this is, and the report talks about this as well, it's linked to two factors. It's linked to an El Nino phenomena forming, which a year after it forms results in global warming or a rise in global temperatures, and of course human factors in addition to that. Is there a possibility that we may not be stuck at 1.5 degrees, that we might actually come back to a lower threshold, but it would be misleading to believe that just coming back to a lower threshold is necessarily a solution? Unless it stays that way, nothing is really achieved, right?
That's right. So the report suggests quite clearly that this is a temporary breach, and then eventually we'll come down to below 1.5. And so in that sense, it doesn't overturn the Paris Agreement, which sets 1.5 degrees as the threshold. That's over many years. But you're right. I mean, this is a warning sign, and this is a very clear sign that something's amiss, and that we need to figure out ways of reacting very quickly and much quicker than we have been in the recent past.
Navroz, what are some of the adverse impacts, damages and losses which we could face, not necessarily in India but perhaps around the world, at 1.5 degrees?
Before I come to that, maybe I could just supplement what Aditya said. I think it's well known in climate circles now that the likelihood is that even if we're thinking about 1.5 degrees as a target, it's 1.5 degrees with overshoot, what's called overshoot. In other words, that we're going to almost certainly increase global average temperatures beyond 1.5, but the ability to limit the extent of that increase as well as increase the probability that we will come back down is tied to how much we can reduce our emissions. Mm-hmm. So therefore, this is just kind of a marker, but we have to work on reducing our emissions. Now, in terms of the kinds of impacts, both in India as well as as well as elsewhere, the kinds of things we'll see are many more people at risk of hunger. The report gives an 11 to, an earlier report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, with which I was associated, gives an 11 to 20% increase in the number of people at risk of hunger, high risk of infrastructure damages. It could lead to GDP losses, and the numbers that get thrown out are on the order of a couple of percent of GDP by 2050 in South Asia. We're going to see across the Indo-Gangetic plains high levels of heat waves, and this is something that Aditya in particular has studied, and our response to heat waves, which perhaps he can talk about. We will see more frequency of droughts and those heat waves, and very tellingly for South Asia, a large proportion of the people who will be exposed to lower agricultural yields, right? So some 300 odd million people will be exposed to lower yields of wheat and corn and other crops. 300 million people exposed, many of them, if not most of them, in South Asia. Mm-hmm. So in other words, development will become much more challengingly, and that's really the trick or the sort of the contorted situation that climate change puts us in. We need energy to develop. Much of our energy is from fossil fuels, but with climate impacts, development itself becomes more challenging, right? Which is why we have to develop, we have to use our energy judiciously, and we have to prepare for what is now inevitable climite impacts.
Aditya, just in terms of what we are facing in India now, I mean, there is a major heat wave which is predicted in parts of southern India. I mean, it's fairly extraordinary the how erratic heat waves have proven to be in the Indian subcontinent, and the impacts which have been horrific. Could you just share with us what some of your own research into this has been indicating?
Yeah, so one of the big things to take away from what we understand about Indian heat waves is there's strong signs that this will have economy-wide impacts and fairly large impacts on the public health system. And like Navroz was suggesting earlier, we're talking about a couple of percentage of GDP potentially being knocked off by the middle of the century. And we're looking at between 5 and 10% of labor hours lost. So there's a question here about what the Indian economic story looks like over the next couple of decades if people can't work.
Right.
And this is very much also striking at the heart of Indian urbanization, which is now the economic opportunity people look to when they move from rural areas. One of the positive signs is the fact that we have heat action plans, and so there are very many of them, many dozens of them across the country, at the state level, at the district level, at the city level. And these provide a set of solutions, and they're fairly expansive in scope. So they'll have, irrigation departments doing certain things, water departments doing certain things, the public health system capacity be ramped up temporarily, and so on. But some of the key issues there are related to how localized they are. So heat is a super local phenomenon, and as we've seen over the last month, it happens in specific contexts where the vulnerability is really, really high. And so it pushes governments to actually find where the vulnerable people are and build protective systems around them. And that's a difficult thing to do. And that's something that we find these heat action plans are taking strides towards, but aren't fully there yet. And the second big thing is that these are unfinanced for the most part. And if you want to have this expansive suite of solutions implemented, one needs to think very hard about financing. Going back to this earlier point, we were making about agriculture, for example, loss and damage, about all these multi-sectoral impacts across, coastal, river flooding, urban flooding, and so on and so forth. We have plans in place that speak to these things, but the real need is to build an institutional structure where they're financed, they're monitored, they are refined over time. There's enough coordination across government departments because it's something very new. This kind of challenge is very different from, say, building roads in the 20th century.
Right.
It's actually going down to every street, it's going down to every city and figuring out what exactly those places need and finding the poorest and most vulnerable populations.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much for, sharing what some of the impacts are with this temperature rise, which is now going to take place in the next 5 years. Perhaps the hottest 5-year period in recorded history, and one of those 5 years may also be the hottest single year in recorded history. It is all very frightening, and it is a crisis. It needs to be recognized as such. I'd like to thank you both very much for joining us.